You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together. Everything.
Hello again, this is Annie Rose Malamet, and you're listening to Girls, Guts, and Giallo Anal Auteurs edition. Anal Auteurs 2.5. And I'm back with Kamikaze Jones. Hi.
Hey everybody, glad to be back for this liminal episode of Anal Auteurs that we are
Yeah.
riffing on the legacy of Kenneth Anger, and perhaps the anal and anal auteurs this time around is for anal retentive, but there's also some visceral anality intact, so we're excited to delve into
Visceral
that.
anality, the solar anus. Yeah, I mean, this episode it's the solar anus. It is like Kamikaze said, it's liminal. Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it. Definitely, especially the Solar Anus by Georges Bataille, in terms of its adherence to parody and the occult and transvaluation, which are all things that are heavily explored in the entire filmography of Kenneth Anger.
Oh my god, we're already getting into we can't help ourselves.
There's so much to unpack.
I know. We always joke that we're so over prepared for these episodes. Even we always think we're not. We're always like, I don't know, or at least I am. I'm like, oh my god, I don't know. I mean, there's so much. Like, did we get enough in there? And then it's like 10 pages of notes.
Yeah, we are cramming the Solar Anus this episode.
So, Kamikaze, can you introduce yourself again for the listeners, even though I'm sure they already know who you are?
So I'm Kamikaze Jones. I am a licensed porn detective, filth correspondent, arts editor of Wussy Magazine. I'm the host of Pure Garbage, an oral examination of John Waters, a podcast, a limited series historical podcast that I did last year that Annie was a very beautiful part of. And I'm also a performance artist and writer that deals primarily in queer pornographic archives and their materialities and how generative they can be, and the holes in those archives and what we can do to breed them.
Oh, so many holes. So, for those of you, if you're listening to this, you're probably aware, but that Kenneth Anger, pioneering experimental gay filmmaker and puckish Crowleyan edgelord Kenneth Anger died this week, this week.
Last week, yeah.
Last week, and natural causes, and I believe he was 96, right? And
I actually think last week it was when his death was announced, but he had actually died maybe some weeks before that. I think they were
settling
out his estate,
some estate stuff, yeah. And so we kind of pulled this episode together really quickly. I have always wanted to do an episode on Kenneth Anger, and now knowing Kamikaze, I think is the perfect person to talk about this with. And I was kind of requesting today, I overslept my nap today, and I was like, please, can you lead this episode? Because I just feel like you're I mean, I just think of you as like the sex magic heir of Kenneth Anger.
Oh my god,
that's how I think of you.
So tickled that you think of me that way. And I do think that you oversleeping is actually a good framework for this meandering elliptical episode that is, riffing on the oneric impulses of Anger's oeuvre, so to speak. So
Ooh.
I mean, we're dealing a lot with unconscious motivation. So maybe you're primed in just the right way.
Yeah, I was having beautiful satanic dreams. So who is Kenneth Anger? I mean, again, I said if you're listening to this, you probably already know, but Kamikaze, can you give us like a little summary of who Kenneth Anger was?
Yeah, so Kenneth Anger was born in Santa Monica, is definitely an LA girly, really just immersed in the mythology of Hollywood from an early age. Had a grandmother who spoiled him, who I believed worked in set or costume design in Hollywood. And already the veracity of his biography and his upbringing becomes kind of an important part of his mythology. And when doing a lot of research for this episode in the past week, it reminded me of our previous Anal Auteurs episode, deconstructing the self-mythologizing of Fred Halstead, where there's a lot of, I wouldn't say there's some self-aggrandizing, but there's also like creating these myths purposefully, which is also fitting that like his death was reported a couple of weeks later because there's just a lot of ambiguity around his timeline. He claims to have been a child actor in I think MGM production of A Midsummer's Night Dream in the 30s, and he claims to have played the changeling prince. And a lot of accounts seem to substantiate or verify that, but then there's also, I think, some Hollywood studio archives that dispute that and claim that it was another child, like a girl actress that played that part. So there's already this idea. Yes, there's all that. And then there's also this like idea of continued ambiguity and veracity that becomes a big part of his work. As a filmmaker, but also as like an infamous gossip columnist in a way, and I think also lends itself in an interesting way to the idea of the occult and to manifestation. And so basically, he created his first film, Fireworks, in 1947. Claiming that he was 17 when in fact he was 20. And a lot of people purport this to be this attitude surrounding his idea of himself as a young provocateur or an enfant terrible. And Fireworks deals with a lot of tropes of American hypermasculinity. And this, as far as I can tell, is maybe before the idea of Aleister Crowley's religion, Thelema, became really central to Anger's life and like the driving principle behind the rest of his later work. But it's really fascinating because a lot of the impulses of Thelema are readily apparent in Fireworks from the get. There's definitely this adherence to the cult of persona, to like American fatalism, but there's also this elemental energy of fire, of ritual, of burning, and cinema as ritual. Like one of his primary quotes and aphorisms, making a movie is casting a spell, or I've always considered movies evil. The day that cinema was invented was a black day for mankind, although of course my definition of evil is not everybody else's. So it could be argued that this nascent innate impulse for the occult and for esoteric knowledge and ritual was already pretty prevalent before he was aligned with the work of Crowley or with Thelema. I think with Fireworks, you have this idea of cinema as ritual, the materiality of cinema, as well as what's depicted on screen, where you actually have Kenneth Anger scratching the film stock to draw halos of light around certain characters. And this idea of Lucifer being the light bearer and being the patron saint of the arts, the visual arts. A lot of fire and light bearing, and he is prevalent throughout Anger's work. And there's also some issues around that because he considers Thelema to be a very masculine kind of occult art or religion that has the idea of fire being aligned with Mars, with the god of war, or, like fire being an innately masculine element. And then you have a lot of his other work that kind of deals more with this approximation to the divine feminine. You have later work like Ode to Artifice, which is shot in Italy at, I think it was a cardinal who was famous for despoiling Hadrian's castle. Which is really funny because there's also a long legacy of Hadrian and like the deification of his lover Antinous, and like the deification of a twink by his daddy. I was recently in Greece and we actually went to like the Eleusinian mysteries, and found all of these, remnants of sculptures of Antinous, and like this idea that a twink could be deified after drowning in the river, which feeds very interestingly into Ode to Artifice, because the whole film is suffused by the energy of spouting water and fountains. And apparently there's a rumor that it's because this cardinal that Anger was paying allegiance to, was heavily into water sports. So you have a lot of elemental forces at play. You have this American idea of fire and death and destruction, and then this like later film which has a European sensibility of play and exploration and fluidity, and like just like the elements of water being transitional and transformative in a different way than fire is. Yeah, and that's just some of the earlier work.
I was hoping you would bring up Fred Halstead, because this idea of myth making is really important to both of these artists, both of these directors. Kenneth Anger is perhaps one of the things he's most famous for is writing the book Hollywood Babylon, which was first published in 1965, but then, got banned and then was published again in 1975. And because of his supposed legacy of being a child actor, which, Kamikaze said, like, we don't know how true that is. He wrote this very infamous gossip rag, trashy book about old Hollywood gossip. And a lot of it, it goes between myth and fact very fluidly. And we were kind of talking about, before we recorded, we were talking about Karina Longworth's season about Hollywood Babylon on her show You Must Remember This, which is excellent and very well researched. And if you want to know about what's true and what's not true, that is the place to go, and you should listen to that. However, we were also kind of talking about how beside the point that is of
I think
Babylon.
we gays are not in the business of debunking today.
No.
And I think the hyperbole espoused in Hollywood Babylon, which some of it has, definitely not aged well.
No.
I think gossip as a queer affect is the main point, and also a reflection onto the impulses of American society.
Yeah.
So you have like a lot of these extreme, like kind of like, like rumors of celebrity suicides and like these kind of like debaucherous orgies. And like, I realized that I had only really had the second edition of Hollywood Babylon, which came out, I think, in the 80s. And also it's important to say that Hollywood Babylon was only published in Europe, and was quickly banned when it was first published in the US, and then reemerged 10 years later and became really popular. And it's kind of like, the mysticism of the tabloid, like the, which is something that John Waters is definitely interested in, like the idea of like the National Enquirer creating like a counter archive of like, like American sensibilities, or like, a rich cultural text into the anxieties of America, much like porn can be. So Hollywood Babylon for me is just more like incendiary, poker face satirical fiction that is played straight, and literally played straight to like kind of like, like toy with heteronormative expectations, arguably.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that the point of it is to be accurate. It's that puckishness again, like what is real, what isn't real. And that is the whole, kind of ethos of Hollywood Babylon. And you have in your notes here the James Dean and Marlon Brando myth, which I feel like is big for his work. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I certainly can. So that myth comes out of Hollywood Babylon 2, and it's very indicative of a lot of Anger's primary interests. And also Marlon Brando and James Dean both show up as fetish objects, as well as like cultural effigies in in his film Scorpio Rising, which deconstructs a lot of like homoerotic biker aesthetics, but also has an interesting thing to say about American approximations of fascism. So James Dean and Marlon Brando, the myth in Hollywood Babylon is that James Dean was like a notorious S&M party sub, and that Marlon Brando would take him to these like leather bars and use James Dean as a human ashtray, and all of the daddies would just stub cigarettes out on James Dean's chest, which is just like the hottest and like also like the most hyperbolic thing. And like I will admit that having this book in high school, I was like, work. I 100% accepted that at face value, and I was like, that is canon. Like,
I still do.
yeah. But that kind of like willing that into existence, into like, you know, like the public imaginary is also an extension of the occult, in my opinion. And an extension of a certain type of mysticism by using these cultural effigies or these cultural symbols to create kind of a, you know, a puckish magical current in the universe. And I think, I'm not sure if we clarified in the beginning, but the de facto production company, which was really just Kenneth Anger getting funding wherever he could for his short films, was called Puck Films. So it plays on this mythology of Puck from A Midsummer Night Dream and the Changeling Prince, and this idea of as above, so below, like you know, transubstantiation, alchemy, appearances being deceptive, and also the idea of like, you know, ceremonial garments in the occult being invested with such mystical imbuement, and that leads to Anger's fascination with leather and with this idea of Marlon Brando and James Dean being in like an intense dom sub human ashtray situation.
So hot. And I mean, it's like you said, it's creating this magical current in the world. I mean, it's like manifesting the kink you want to see in the world.
Yeah, write the kink you want to see in the world. And in a way that brings us neatly to his involvement with certain other incendiary characters in like the 1950s avant-garde, including the diarist slash famed erotica writer Anais Nin, and also the Scarlet Woman, Whore of Babylon, Marjorie Cameron, which is something that we could talk about for a long time. But that, for those of y'all who don't know, Marjorie Cameron was basically the wife of Jack Parsons, who was a rocket scientist who was working with L. Ron Hubbard before L. Ron Hubbard started Scientology on a series of sex magic rituals called Babylon Working that come from Aleister Crowley. And one of the intents of the sex magic rituals was to summon the sacred whore, or this whore of Babylon, the Scarlet Woman, in, and to have her manifest in like an actual human. So Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard were doing all these rituals, and one day Jack comes home to his apartment and Marjorie Cameron is there as the guest of a friend who's staying there, and she has like fiery red hair and like piercing blue eyes, and he immediately sees her as this invocation of the Scarlet Woman that he's been seeking. So they get married, and she was uninitiated in the occult before this, and then he dies in a dubious rocket explosion in his apartment, and she thinks that it might be because of anti-Zionists. And then she starts doing a series of rituals to continue his work. And that's when she gets involved with Kenneth Anger. And I think also the occult filmmaker Curtis Harrington, who put her in Night Tide with Dennis Hopper. So she became like this really intense, often maligned figure of the occult that was subject to a lot of misogyny that was rampant in like occult circles at the time, but kind of forged her own path and was like a brilliant visionary painter, and like, you know, became this entity in a lot of experimental cinema. And her and Anais Nin both starred in Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, which in a lot of ways is the first culmination of like the occult in the most like direct way in the earlier part of Anger's work.
I also wanted to mention, just because you had it in your notes, Puce Moment.
Yes, we definitely should.
And the fetishization of clothing and ceremonial garb, and also your note here about popular songs as incantations. And I wanted to know what you were thinking about both of those things. I mean, in Puce Moment, I forgot how beautiful it is when I rewatched it. And it's always like interesting to see women in Kenneth Anger movies because the way that he approaches women is so different than the way that he approaches men. It's more like goddess figures, whereas the men are more like lived in, and earthly is my that would be it would be
Yeah.
my take. More you can touch them, you can fuck them, and the women are much more um objects of, I mean, men are objects of worship too, but the women are objects of worship in like the way that the fag worships the goddess. It's very,
Totally.
yeah, if you want to run with
Yeah.
that.
Well, no, I was definitely, there's a lot of like camp worship, but there's also
Mhm.
that dovetails in a really interesting way with this idea of immanence or an imbuement, and a lot of like, um, women being these vessels for the divine in occult practices. Whereas like, I'm not sure you would consider the way that he depicts men as base or devoid of mysticism, which is not the case at all, but there's definitely more of like a possession
Yes.
happening, like a deified possession in the way that he treats women in his films. And it's interesting because there's still a lot of contemporary ideas. I wish we had time to like kind of delve into maybe like a contemporary trans critique of Kenneth Anger's work, because I think there's a lot to be said about the way that like contemporary gay men fetishize trans women in social
Totally.
circles. And I think
And that goes back to
from what
Fred
I've gathered,
Halstead too.
yeah, totally, from in Sex Tool, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and hmm, that's so fascinating. And I think the idea that men are objects of worship and are also the practitioners of these certain rituals, and then they summon or invoke these divine feminine
Right.
archetypes.
That's kind of what I was
Um,
getting at. Yeah.
yeah, and the women are rarely facilitating or orchestrating these rituals,
Right.
um, but they are needed for their completion.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Definitely, Annie and I have been having a lot of conversations about fag for dyke representation in the history of cinema. This,
Totally. I'm just thinking about how different like dyke art the relationship is in experimental dyke film to like the figure of the goddess as opposed to in Kenneth Anger's, where there is such a remove, there's such old Hollywood glamour camp sensibility where it's it, yeah, it's just not, because men are, like you said, men are deified too. Like it's not that they're not. It's just that they are the facilitators, and women are more statuesque, and I mean statuesque in the sense of like idol worship, I like pure
yeah,
idolatry. Yeah.
and the men take an active role in the ritual, and the women are a passive role, and that kind of speaks to the misogynist critiques of Aleister Crowley's work, um in a whole, because I was recently just reading that he was like anti-abortion, which I think is hysterical. Like
It's
he was like, do as
ridiculous.
thou wilt, but like if you're really gonna do what you really wanted, you wouldn't like abort your baby. Like that was kind of his take. And I was like, but he was also like kind of a social Darwinist. And um and he also believed that when he was doing homosexual sex magic, he always had to be the bottom because of like a certain adherence to masochism. So there's a lot to be said about that.
Oh wow.
um Yes. And yeah, and he also claimed to have numerous scarlet women throughout his life, like these women that were the invocations of the whore of Babylon. And so Puce moment was also maybe perhaps before Kenneth Anger really turned to Thelema, but it still has the nascent conceptualization of it, where it's an adherence to this type of metaphysical drag, or like this mystique that's involved with the Hollywood starlet, and the fetishization of certain garments and silks and textures. They're all superimposed over this image of a goddess rummaging, like a Hollywood screen goddess rummaging through her closet. And that also brings me back to I was a big fan of Anais Nin's diaries when I was younger, and
Oh yeah, me too.
I remember her saying, I'm going to crudely paraphrase as well, but there's a big thing about the ritualization of costume, almost like it immediately makes me think of like, and that was the revolutionary costume of today. And it's kind of like that, where it's like she would dress for how she needed to manifest herself in the world. And like she would dress as a warrior, she would dress like, and just like the occult properties of clothing and the materiality of imbuing certain garments with the aspects of ritual is very prevalent throughout all of Anger's work. And in Pugh's moment, you know, that definitely manifests as this kind of ritual. But getting back to what you were saying about pop music as incantation, that's something that like heavily informs a lot of my own work as an artist, where you could see music that exists in the popular imaginary as a type of immaterial archive or a counter archive, especially in the way that it's used in a lot of Anger's work to subvert the original intention of the music and to complicate its meaning. Where you have like Dream Lover being used in Custom Car Commandos, which is a film about the fetishization of the motor vehicle from a homoerotic perspective. Or you have Leader of the Pack playing during like, you know, a Nazi salute in Scorpio Rising, or during like, you know, an intense violent motorcycle crash. I think that we've talked about citationalism as a distinctly queer affect, and the repurposing sonic hegemonies for queer pursuits. And I think Anger's work does that so beautifully and so provocatively, by creating this kind of counter canon of semiotics when it comes to how queer people relate to popular music.
And because you've done the Pure Garbage series on John Waters, I have to bring him up too, because they're I think Kenneth Anger is like 20 something years older than John Waters, but they use a lot of very similar music in their work. You know, romantic 50s and 60s pop songs. And how do you think that the way John Waters uses music is different or similar to how Kenneth Anger uses it?
Oh, that's such a great question. I honestly feel like ritual is more apparent in Anger's use of music, like ceremony, like the idea that this music can be used to manifest. And I think they both use it for subversion and for camp appeal, and that much, and for transvaluation. But I think perhaps Waters, he always claims to be non-political in his work, but I kind of gently disagree with that. Like, I think his
Totally.
work is
Yeah.
inherently political. And I do agree that Anger's is too, but I think that the music is chosen as an aspect of the ceremony, as a way of divining will from, you know, popular American culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that so fascinating, because even the idea of like, you know, like covering a song or interpreting a song has its own occult sensibility, because you're imbuing it with your likeness, with your energy, with your aura, and then refracting it out into the world.
That is resonating with me so much right now because I saw The Cure on Saturday and I brought a brooch I have, like a Black Widow spider brooch, and I was like hoping that they would play Lullaby so I could like charge my brooch with it. I've been feeling really witchy lately. Anyway, yeah, I think that that's a really good distinction, is that the songs are very much part of the ritual, whereas like in it's like it's very much invoking meaning in the song, like with Leader of the Pack, and like running with that meaning and like elevating it to this other place, whereas John Waters' use of songs is more like in friction with the music. And you know, he obviously loves the music, but he's also like transgressing it and like subverting and perverting it. So whereas like Kenneth Anger I don't know if this is the right word, but it's like almost like a little bit more sincere. Like it's, but not, because this is Puck we're talking about. So it's more, like you said, it's more like an invocation. So
I will just say before we seg is that the idea that all of these films are meant to be magical objects, and by utilizing music, which is often used in ceremonies across, you know, religions or across like practices, it creates a particular affinity for the occult that implodes like the American subconscious. And that's really fascinating to me. Is like I think that all this music from his films, it imbues my life with a very particular and distinct meaning. And you could think of like this kind of like 1950s like American doo-wop music as like a portal into different queer temporalities in the way that he uses it.
yes, and okay, we have to talk about this because this I didn't know about. Between the ages of 11 and 16, while studying at Beverly Hills High School, Anger made 7 short films which have never been shown, and they were lost or destroyed in 1967 when Anger publicly burned his work, shortly before taking out a full-page advertisement at the Village Voice announcing his own death.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, he was a messy bitch who lived for drama. That
yeah,
much is certain.
yeah.
Recently, Bruce the Bruce came out with an Instagram anecdote about Anger putting a hex on him because. Oh yeah, yes. So Bruce the Bruce, I think his character in Hustler White is named Jurgen Anger. It's a portmanteau of 2 different directors, and the whole joke is like any relation to Kenneth throughout the whole film in Hustler White. And Kenneth Anger was apparently so mad about Bruce using his name in that way that he put a hex on him and then claimed to a friend that he wanted to bury him in a desert and like rub his head with a cactus or something like that. So Kenneth definitely was a messy bitch who lived for drama. And also something else that's really interesting to me is like how much time he spent with Kinsey, actually contributing to the Kinsey archive. And I was reading something recently where a lot of his contributions to the archive are his own films, but also films of other queer avant-garde filmmakers. And also just objects and ephemera that are only tangentially related to the idea of sexuality, but provide kind of like a deviant, almost like peripheral cultural context for how capitalism has shaped contemporary sexuality and stuff of that nature. And then speaking of the archive, Gloria Swanson was so mad about what Kenneth Anger said about her in Hollywood Babylon that she sued him for libel, and he responded by sending her a series of cursed and or enchanted objects, one of which being a foot-long coffin filled with sugar. Because apparently Gloria Swanson would go on a lot of public tirades against junk food. So
this is so good. Yeah, he was a fucking troll, man. He was the original troll.
the OG troll.
Yeah, and I mean, he also, speaking again of Karina Longworth, if you ever want to find out how Kenneth Anger was involved with some of the figures in the Manson murders, like Bobby Beausoleil, that's her season on Charles Manson. It talks a lot about Kenneth Anger and his occult practices of the time and what a messy bitch he was. So again, another parallel with John Waters, who has a friendship with Leslie Van Houten, right?
Totally.
One of the Manson women. So John Waters seems to be like more oriented towards women. If we're, yeah, again talking about women and gay men, he seems to. I feel like John Waters' the women that he uses it's like more embodied. More.
He definitely gives them more agency.
Yeah, a lot more agency. Exactly. Yeah. So moving on to inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, which you've talked about a little bit. Tell me more about Thelema and Lucifer as a teenage rebel.
I can definitely do that. So yeah, inauguration of the Pleasure Dome came out of like a like trendy salon party called Come Dressed as Your Own Madness, where a lot of people that were loosely involved
Okay,
in the
we need to do
avant-garde and the
that.
occult. Oh, I know. Yeah, we totally should.
Yeah.
That can be your next birthday party.
Exactly.
So a lot of the outfits that are featured in inauguration of the Pleasure Dome were the original outfits that certain people wore to that party. So Anais Nin came dressed as Astarte, who's considered a sex goddess, but also a goddess of the moon with a bird cage over her head. And then I believe someone came dressed as the somnambulist from the Isle of Dr. Caligari. And then there were a couple of other occult figures. There was Kali. There was, I think, the Satanic Beast. And they basically, in inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, there is this fetishization of like certain talismans or jewels that are associated with certain divine archetypes. And I think the idea of alchemy is most apparent in this work, where he achieves this kind of magical effect through superimposition and through like the collapsing of temporal narratives, and these archetypes are partying together, and like they drink the wine of ecstasy, and then things go awry, or do they? Or it's this this ambivalent metamorphosis, or this like invocation of certain archetypes that Anger hopes to communicate with in the material world. And that is pretty much the apotheosis of the first phase of his career, before moving into more, I think, directly occult influence works, with culminating in Lucifer Rising, which he received a lot of funding for, that also had like one incarnation that was scrapped and became the material used for Invocation of My Demon Brother, which has glimpses of Mick Jagger, but also music by Mick Jagger on the Moog synthesizer. Anger was like really hobnobbing with a lot of like countercultural figures, like had a friendship and then a falling out with Jimmy Page, was friends with Marianne Faithfull and Anita Pallenberg. Even before this, he submitted fireworks to a festival where Jean Cocteau awarded it the first prize for like poetic film, and they became really close. So he had a lot of, support in Europe and like the expat community, and a lot of countercultural icons. And a lot of his later work focuses on these more concentrated occult rituals, be it kind of like, well, I guess you could argue that it's a denouncement of fascism in Scorpio Rising. I think there's a lot of interesting things to be said about Custom Car Commandos, which is a 3-minute short detailing a very homoerotic polishing of like a beautiful vehicle against a pink backdrop, to the song Dream Lover. And thinking of the car as like an occult object, especially to Americans, and the idea of, thinking of J.G. Ballard and like, the fascination with the Jane Mansfield crash, or thinking about the fascination with the James Dean crash, and how it's an exertion of American fatalism and like a death ritual. And like, I think there's a quote that Kenneth Anger says that Scorpio Rising was polished chrome, leather, and Thanatos and bursting jeans. So this idea of the American death drive and externalizing these occult practices through that is heavily prevalent in that later work. And then Lucifer Rising, which was one of his final films of that period, deals with this idea of Thelema, that is the Aeon of Horus. So in Thelema, there's 3 aeons. There's the Aeon of Isis, which is when the world was ruled by a matriarchal presence. There's the Aeon of Osiris, which is when the world was ruled by a patriarchal presence. And then through Lucifer Rising, Anger hopes to explore the Aeon of Horus, which is the age of the child, and therefore synonymous with the return of Lucifer, the light bearer, the precocious teen rebel, who's the patron of the visual arts and the patron of magic and revelation and knowledge. And you see this kind of, we as queer people undergo multiple puberties, but you see this a lot in Anger's work to an extent, where like even in Fireworks, like the ritual of fire, of revelation, of like sexual discovery is so important, so inextricably linked to the idea of explosion, to like, you know, something incendiary, to this like, you know, light bearing. And that theme continues so prominently throughout the rest of the work, even in Lucifer Rising, where he had, you know, the funding to shoot in Egypt with actual like, you know, like pyramids and like, you know, divine artifacts. And I think we could dedicate a whole other episode to the use of Egyptology in like Kenneth Anger's work. But you know, we're just two gays doing our best.
Yeah, truly, like this is such rich territory. Like you could go in so many directions here. Like if you guys haven't familiarized yourself with his work, like it's all basically all on YouTube. I haven't seen, which I tried to find, and perhaps like I just don't know where, or if it's like even available, is the his telling of Histoire d'eau. Have you seen
Oh
it?
yeah, I feel like it might be lost,
Right, that's what I thought.
or it might have been burned.
Yeah, one of those. You have a note here, that just says Anais Nin smeared with heroin powder. What does that mean?
Oh, that's just like another messy bitch who lives for drama moment, where apparently Kenneth Anger was like talking shit about like having to redo a take in inauguration of the Pleasure Dome because like Anais Nin's cheek was smeared in heroin powder. That was just like one thing I came across in my studies, which, you know, I wouldn't put it past her or any of them. I think seeing these films work as like magical objects is really important because of how they're presented and how they're cut as like an alchemical process, but also the rituals depicted within them, where it's Anger claims to have like had a ceremonial circle consecrated with both blood and cum in Lucifer Rising, which I think is important to note. One of his earlier films, Rabbit's Moon from 1971, which is personally very important to
Yes,
me and like my own.
tell me all about Rabbit's Moon.
So I don't think I've ever publicly told this story before, but basically I've had, ever since I was younger, like a deep, strange, lingering personal mythology when it comes to rabbits and the moon. And it started when this sketchy kid from high school sold me two rabbits and told me they were both men. And I went away for a field trip and came back and they had given birth and eaten their young. And it was traumatizing for me. And it was basically, the cage was covered in blood. And I think the mother had gone mad from eating her young. So she was like twitching. And I came back from like a high school like choir ski trip
No.
to like this carnage in my room that no one knew about because I was hiding the rabbits from my parents. And that was on the full moon. So ever since then, I have had important pivotal moments and crossroads in my life where literally every time I have to make like an important decision, I will happen upon a full moon with a dead rabbit completely under it. And it's happened multiple times, and it's showed up in my dream life. And it always signifies like a major shift in my life. And I had seen Rabbit's Moon at this point, and Rabbit's Moon is this, and I've also in my own performance art, I've like recreated the Pierrot archetype from Rabbit's Moon. But I think Rabbit's Moon in particular is a very singular expression of queer longing that is dissimilar from other projects in Anger's filmography. I mean, not necessarily dissimilar, but like it approaches queer longing in a singular way for me, where it's Pierrot is kind of queer coded and like a drag character. And he's kind of using the archetypes of like commedia dell'arte to explore this like impossibility of longing for the moon. And for me, that like, you know, this lunar ritual like deals a lot with queer longing and like kind of like nocturnal entities and like the subterranean and like the invisible, or like, you know, the things that are obscured in darkness. And then you have like the presentation of like Columbina and the masculine character where it's almost cucking Pierrot. And all this is set to, there's also the other interesting thing about a lot of Anger's work is he would like do multiple edits and release multiple versions and like kind of tweak the rituals, so to speak. But the version that I'm most familiar with has these popular songs from the 1950s, and it's the first time I ever heard there's a Moon Out Tonight by the Capris, or like Bye Bye Baby by Mary Wells, and like and using all of these songs that are about like kind of like extreme testaments of devotion to address this like lunar cosmic queer longing, or the impossibility of queerness and this utopian longing almost through this like sad clown Pierrot character. So yeah, that's my story when it comes to that. I have like a deep fondness for that film in particular.
Oh, wow. That is quite a story. And the that is so traumatic. I'm just and yeah, the Pierrot clown, and also thinking about the masquerade aspect of inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, and the mask and the costume itself as ritual, like we're talking about, and also the idea of um, the mask as the clown as like a trickster god. Um, so much trickster imagery, and then with something like, well, we'll talk about this. We should talk about the fascism stuff. I mean, um, Invocation of My Demon Brother, right, has Anton LaVey as satanic majesty. I mean, I feel like there's so much there with Anton LaVey and his quote unquote problematic views, and of course, Custom Car Commandos is KKK, which is like a nod to the Brotherhood of the Ku Klux Klan, and likening that to like homosexual brotherhood. And that's also present in fireworks, of course, with the militarized imagery, and in Scorpio Rising with the Nazi imagery. Scorpio Rising, maybe I'm a basic bitch, but I think that's my favorite. Kenneth Anger. I mean, it's just so like singular. Like it's Scorpio Rising. It's like hot and, leather and all of these great pop songs, and this gay satanic ritual, which is also, present, of course, in Invocation of My Demon Brother. And yeah, I thought, and then with Lucifer Rising and the music by Bobby Beausoleil, you can't help but think of occult Nazi imagery when you recall anybody associated with Charles Manson. So, Charles Manson, of course, was, famously trying to bring about a race war, and was also using like very messy, like acid fueled occult practices. So, and there's stuff there too with Kenneth Anger has said, or some of the quotes that have been pulled recently in his, like in the wake of his death, are the famous one where he says he's to the right of the KKK or something like that, in his viewpoints, and people don't know if he was just being like, like it was a Crowley-esque joke, or if that was his, if he was actually, a fascist. And of course, that's something that we've talked about also with Fred Halstead. And
Yeah, and the Wikipedia entry is kind of, it doesn't really give much context. It's like, yeah, this opened him up to criticism of racism, but it might have just been like a Crowley-esque joke. But he also supported the Tibetan independence movement. And it's like,
I know, it's
okay,
so bizarre. Who wrote that? Yeah, it's so weird. Yeah. So, and then, the Nazi, like the Third Reich, was super into the occult, and invoking these invocations and manifesting and ritual, which is why the Third Reich was so ritualized, and the swastika too, as like an ancient symbol. It very, very much based in quote unquote idolatry, which is of course like one of the main ways that Judaism is different than the religions that came before it. Idolatry is very much against Judaism. Catholicism, which is heavily based in occult and object worship is like very much against the essence sort of the Jewish religion. So yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm rambling here because there's so many places we could go, but I wanted to talk with you, Kamikaze, a little bit about that stuff. I don't want us to be like afraid to be critical. And also I want us to just like give a fair assessment of the work. Like, what do we think about the Nazi imagery, and what do we think about the things that he said, and where do we think that falls in with the occult ritual going on in the work?
Totally. I think that Anger, from what I've gathered, falls prey to this kind of aristocratic exotification that was prevalent in the occult. Like, it's the idea of like, um, how do I put this? Like, there's obviously rampant appropriation, like, happening with like different world religions. And then there's like the idea of like, the seminal book, like the Golden Bough, and like, kind of like creating a link between all these world religions, and like how that's like kind of like a dated means of anthropology, but also very like generative for a lot of like, spiritualist thought or occult thought, or like, Theosophical Society, or just like our conceptualizations of world religion and like certain archetypes that are prevalent and like ubiquitous throughout like global theology. With Kenneth, I think that he fell prey to kind of maybe like a noble savage approximation of certain like cultures. I think it's really interesting juxtaposing like his work to like the work of Maya Deren, who studied with like a pretty famous Haitian dancer and then became initiated as a voodoo priestess, and also has a very interesting and singular relationship to ritual in cinema. I would venture to say that Anger is less successful in having like a good racial politic in his work. I think that also he, in Hollywood Babylon, says some really crude things about Lupe Velez and her suicide that are racially charged, about like her like just like fabricating the fact that she ate 500 sleeping pills and like drowned in a pool of her own vomit in a toilet. I think there was like some Lupe con carne was like the language that he used at one point. And like, it's obviously like a type of like provocation that's aged poorly and is a product of the time. I don't think it's hard rewatching Scorpio Rising. The Nazi imagery doesn't personally offend me, but I think it's interesting to hear your perspective on this as a Kingster Yenta, as we've discussed. I think that it draws really interesting connections to the idea of how the swastika was used as a sigil or as an occult symbol in a way to justify fascism and to make fascism palatable for a large group of people and to create this culture-bound syndrome. I think also his repurposing of like like C-movie biblical narratives in Scorpio Rising, where like Christ is giving sight to someone, and juxtaposing that with this Nazi iconography and like leader of the pack, the song, and like mob mentality, and like the idea of fraternity, and that's even explored in Fireworks, this like Eros Thanatos like death drive of like American masculinity and mob mentality and like military aesthetics. Like it doesn't seem like it's in bad faith to me. It doesn't seem like it's like an empty provocation.
No, I don't think it is either. Like I think where where it becomes complicated for me is that it is also clearly romantic. And but that said, like I don't find any of the Nazi imagery in his work like offensive. It's more so there's a friction there because it's which I believe is purposeful because of its relationship to sadomasochistic imagery and the way that gay men's leather culture has really come out of the aesthetics of World War II, and then the motorcycle culture that came out of that those aesthetics. And I think he's very
And then even gay skinhead culture too. Like,
exactly gay skinhead culture for sure. Yeah, and I think that, and Bruce LaBruce is another artist that has played with this, and I think where the friction comes up for me, I know I keep saying that word, but I think where it comes up for me is that sometimes I feel that having an ambiguous or complicated relationship with the aesthetics of fascism is almost, it's like, to be ambiguous about it is almost to like reify it.
sure.
And I think that it's just something that I don't think artists who aren't like cis white men can play with as freely. And I think that there is something to be said for the way that cis white gay men historically, and especially in leather culture, have been so comfortable with that imagery in a way that even a cis white gay Jewish man couldn't be. Um
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean there's so much there too, like, even thinking about Tom of Finland and the Tom of Finland Foundation, and the way that the Nazi soldiers that Tom of Finland like fucked when he was a young man became objects in the fetish art. And I don't know, I guess I'm like curious in your perspective as a, a gay man in kink.
Hmm.
Do you have any thoughts about the the Nazi fetish imagery in Kenneth Anger's work, and like the actual Leathermen's community's relationship with those images?
It's it's interesting for me because it's never something that I've come across personally in my own sexual exploits somehow. Like I've never really, speaking of friction, I've never really rubbed against it in a meaningful or tangible way. Um, thinking about Fred Halstead and like Andy Campbell's Bound Together, and like leather is kind of resignification of military aesthetics and like a subverting of traditional hypermasculinity, but also thinking of leather as like a memento mori, and like, even the cigarette as like, a symbol of fatalism, and like how these death cults are perpetuated through these certain aesthetics. My personal opinion is I agree with you. I think like I can't really think of like work that is like reappropriated or like subverted Nazi imagery in a tangible way that hasn't been made by like a cis white gay man. Like nothing comes to mind. I mean, even thinking of like I think David Bowie flirted with like Nazi propaganda at one point in his career. Um, yeah, that's interesting. And like I don't know if it's just like a collective trauma, like if it's the idea of like the sailors are obviously more ambiguous in fireworks and have less allegiance. Something interesting to also state is like obviously Aleister Crowley had some backwards ideas about a lot of things, but I think his novel Moonchild, which is like an important text for a lot of Thelema and for Anger, culminates in this idea of like a war between white magic and black magic. And uh, it's supposed to, I think there's a child that's supposed to be conceived that's a moon child that will like usher in the new era of revelations. And the novel ends with the white magicians, or the white magic practitioners joining the allied forces, and the black magic practitioners joining Germany. And then with Marjorie Cameron, after Jack Parsons died, she created a cult of intentionally mixed race occultists to try and create a moonchild, an interracial moonchild, to usher in this new era of revelations, which is super complicated too. Um,
And that brings us back to
so
like the Manson race war stuff too.
yeah, to Helter
Yeah.
Skelter.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what happens for me is, um sometimes I don't know if these practitioners are like I feel like Manson's Helter Skelter is maybe like the most honest distillation of that. Like, we're sort of hoping for this kind of war. Like, we sort of want to bring this
Yeah.
about, want to bring this change about. And of course, like the association with L. Ron Hubbard, and like all of these people like culminating and mixing together. I mean, it's uncomfortable. I mean, and this kind of thing also carries over even into like 80s goth subculture, right? Like Susie Sue had a moment with Third Reich imagery, and a lot of artists who come out of this tradition, this like satanic tradition of the 50s and 60s, do have those moments.
Yeah.
And I think it's just like the power of the Third Reich occult imagery is like so rich, and like I was saying before we recorded, it's such an historical anomaly and exists really singularly in that period of history. And I think it's maybe as simple as like people who don't have that same kind of generational trauma, because I think everybody of that generation had like World War II trauma, but I think it's just different for Jewish people. I think
Yeah.
I think that if you don't, I think people who just, know that they maybe wouldn't have, I mean, what am I trying to get at here? It's also interesting because gay men would have also been victimized by the Third Reich. At the same time, there are so many gay Nazis. But you can't really say the same of like Jewish people. Like it's like there's a different like there's not as much friction there, right?
Do you think there's like something to be said about like generational trauma being absorbed into like widespread kink practices? Like even before we were recording, we were talking about the night porter, and like talking about like gay men's relationship to the idea of danger, and like like cruising being predicated on risk, and then like even like we can like draw a thread to contemporary ideas of like bug chasing and pornography, or like every shitty sappy AIDS drama that's been made in the wake of the AIDS pandemic. Like there's something about like mining trauma and like what the actual intent is, and the ambiguity of intent, which it's really interesting that the ambiguity of intention in Scorpio rising is kind of mirrors the ambiguity of like the uninitiated spectator in a lot of Anger's work. Like is it coded as queer, or is it coded as a cult? Like is it esoteric? Is it meant to be an esoteric condemnation of fascism, and is it meant
Right.
only for the initiated? And the maybe perceived irresponsibility of making such an ambiguous gesture, like which is also the perceived irresponsibility of creating a work like Hollywood Babylon.
Yeah, and it's we're also dealing with such, I think that's the way that you put it is really good, like the irresponsibility of the ambiguity. Because the ambiguity is also what makes it so enigmatic and fascinating, right? But at the same time, to be ambiguous about fascist imagery is like a slippery slope, right? As we've seen now with the benefit of hindsight in 2023, which is not something that would have been present in the 50s and 60s and 70s, where you have like the literal survivors of World War II still alive and very much present in the conversation. And this is something I talked about a lot with Nayland Blake in our episode that we did on the Eyes of Laura Mars. Like, it was just so much more common. He was just talking about how when he was, a teenager in the 70s, it was just so much more common to meet people whose parents were Holocaust survivors or who had been in World War II. It was really present. So the idea of addressing that in like really confrontationally was very subversive at the time that Kenneth Anger was making this work. Whereas now to use fascist imagery is completely unsubversive. Like, it's not subversive at all. It's like very mainstream, very like tech bro, crypto bro, like uncool, you know? So like, we're also like working in a very different context here.
Well, and it echoes back to conversations that we had about like the transgressive now being mined as reactionary
Yes.
in contemporary culture. And it also, I will mention that a member of the American Nazi Party, when Scorpio Rising came out, condemned the film, and was very mad about it, and
That's
like had like a
badass.
whole tirade about it. So there is that.
Right.
But that, I don't think that really clarifies. And maybe it is a question of posterity. Maybe it is like a contemporary lens that renders it more irresponsible
I
than it
think
was then.
so. Yeah. That's really my take on it, is I think that viewing it in historical context is really key. Whereas like just showing Scorpio rising now, like I think it would be, I think there needs to be explanation and context and understanding of who this artist was and what was going on at the time in regards to these things. So yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I think now, I mean, now if someone made something like Scorpio Rising, yeah, I mean, it's just a completely different context. Like you said, like the reactionary, like the subversive being mined for the reactionary, this idea that like, you know, the political correctness movement of the 90s has like become the like quote unquote woke movement, and that's like the dominant ideology. And you know, to kind of roll with that is like inherently problematic now.
And it's also interesting that a lot of these films that are, a lot of these films that are coming out, that are uh, overtly socially conscious, in a way that appeals to a demographic that doesn't exist and has so much needless exposition,
Yes.
immediately dates the film, and like and like just immediately ages its sentiment, and also makes it less likely for it to shine favorably in posterity. And I will say that a lot of, I think what works about Kenneth Anger's films is that they operate on a subliminal and visceral level. So I don't know, it's so interesting. It's like I feel like a lot of contemporary film doesn't really do that anymore, because it has to be delineated, or the narrative has to be needlessly demarcated,
Totally.
to the point of redundancy.
Like, we need to take a
Not to just
stance against this. Even though it's being
Yes,
made by like Disney or something, which is like a fucking fascist corporation.
but a lot of these films come off as like a sternly worded HR email,
Yes.
like, and that is against the subversive spirit that we're exploring here, for better or for worse. Um,
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's part of, like I said, I think that's part of what's so fascinating about, and what's going to continue to be resonant about Kenneth Anger's work is the friction there. The
mhm.
You know, like you said, like Scorpio Rising is, it's clearly not like, aren't Nazis great? That's clearly not like the thesis of the film. But what the where the conflict does arise is like the you know, romantic and hot nature in which it's depicted, while also, but then the fascination there is like, while also being, you know, compared to Christianity and um fascism, like comparing Christianity and fascism, and interrogating the like homosocial brotherhood that happens in like militarized settings.
Yeah. And how the other, or the marginalized sexual identity, is susceptible to predominant social narratives, and could
Yes.
easily be assimilated into such a mentality in a means of belong, or as a means of belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's continues to be like an extremely rich territory. So, I mean, that's why I love Scorpio Rising, and that's why that's my favorite Kenneth Anger film, is because I feel like it's like a distillation of all of this stuff in that one film. Um, and I also love Lucifer Rising. I mean, come on, that score, like,
And to think that he composed that in prison,
right? I know, it's
that Bobby
crazy.
Beausoleil, yeah, that's like oh. And also it's kind of funny that his name in French kind of means like handsome son.
Yeah.
Bobby Handsome Son.
Yeah, I mean, Bobby Beausoleil was like such a gay icon at that time, I feel like. Um it, and then Custom Car Commandos, like it's like I hate to use this word again, but it's like a troll, like it's such a beautiful, like, gore, like it's so beautiful, that video. If you haven't seen it, like, just look it up on YouTube. It's only 3 minutes long, and it's like so gorgeous and meditative and like feminine. And then you just have the titles like like a recalling German, but then also likening itself to the KKK, like it's supposed to make you, uncomfortable. And I guess the question I would just pose, and I think what a lot of younger queer people are posing now, is like, how transgressive is that really? To just like, discomfort, like, for the sake of it. How transgressive is that really? And I don't even know what the answer to that is, because I'm like, sort of, I don't know, I'm feeling my age, like like I still find that worthy of pursuing. But I also like want to listen to the youth, and respect them, and hear them out. And of course they're not a monolith, but yeah, just some thoughts I'm
Yeah, and
having.
I'm 33, and I feel like we've
Same.
had this conversation before about yeah. So I mean, like, I think we're in an interesting kind of like liminal space generationally, where I think like the efforts of the transgressive movement are important, but they also are, were very much filtered through a lens of whiteness for a long time. And I think the idea of like meaningful post-transgressive work in like contemporary art has to come from like a more inclusive, like holistic kind of like uh array of perspectives, and has to have, I think ethical transgression is possible, and I think it's really interesting.
Yes.
And I think people who bristle at that idea are lazy, or like racist, or like like lack originality. And like that's why I think you see like the cringe lord aesthetic becoming so prevalent, sadly, because like it's still like a lot of white guys who are like, well, why can't we be provocative? Like, I don't get it
And
anymore.
then
Like,
it
why
right.
can't we reclaim misogyny? Like, isn't that cool? Like,
Yeah, and then of course, like, the question is, how transgressive is that really, to like reinforce the dominant narrative of things, even though it might feel transgressive in like a leftist queer circle, but to the world at large, like, how transgressive is that really? And before we recorded too, I was thinking, speaking of like ethical transgression, I was thinking of the artist M. Lamar, who I bring up a lot on this show, who I think is like one of the most important living artists of our time. And I think is someone who, you know, is really mining the fetishistic nature of transatlantic slave trade imagery in a way that no one else is. And I would consider like a spiritual successor of artists like Kenneth Anger, who are using, I mean, I would consider slavery imagery is like linked to fascism. I mean, the Third Reich like literally used methods from the transatlantic slave trade and studied them. So I would consider them tied together historically, and that's an example of an artist who I think is using that stuff to such an actually transgressive end. Um
yeah.
yeah.
And we've had this conversation before where I feel like a lot of the really important work happening with transgressive art in just like our contemporary setting is happening with queer performance artists, and it's not happening necessarily with cinema because of the interference of capital and like, like streaming networks and like, AI at this point. I mean, like, I think obviously, like, the work of Sam Delaney is a great, like, like precursor to this idea of contemporary ethical transgression. But I mean, obviously, we both love Christine, we both love M. Lamar. We love a lot of people who are creating these kind of like live, very somatically charged experiences that mine the transgressive without being exclusionary or like uh without having empty provocation.
Empty provocation, exactly. And John Waters always says too, like, don't shock people just for the sake of it. Like, there should be a reason. So on that note, this is just a little bit about Kenneth Anger.
I think we did. I think we covered a lot of ground
We
for
did, yeah, for
I
slapping
have
this
to. Yeah,
together.
yeah. I
And
think so. It was a
Kamikaze is
good.
like going to Spain tomorrow.
I'm going to Spain tomorrow. I'm a mess. I'm Chaos Magic City. We're both, we're both mired by logistics, and I think we meandered around the general perimeter of what we needed to discuss. I think,
Absolutely. And
as we always do, in a sexy way.
in a sexy way. Can you just remind people where to find you on the internet?
Hey, yeah, so I'm Kamikaze Jones. You can find me on Instagram at Kamikaze Jones _ I think. I think I have a pesky underscore there. And also the same thing on Twitter. And I'm also, as I said, the arts editor for Wussy Magazine. I am leaving for Spain to do my first international residency tomorrow. And I will be doing a text-based project that will incorporate the mythopornographic and the idea of cruising ecologies and how they may map onto sacred spaces. So revisiting Kenneth Anger has been fruitful for me, as you can imagine.
Perfect. That's kind of what I was hoping. I was like, hopefully this will fit into both work that we're respectively doing. And you know where to find me. Girls Guts Jalo on Instagram and Girls Guts Jalex on Twitter because your girl was banned. Like, a year and a half ago, and now there's an X there. So, and sign up for if you like what I'm doing, sign up for my Patreon. That's where I make most of my money when I'm not chained to my desk doing various freelance projects for some distribution companies. Patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo. Check it out, support me. I have a really cool Discord community of like the biggest perverted freaks you could ever hope to meet. I'm like constantly in awe of how insane those people are. In a good way. Love you all. And with that note, thank you so much for joining me, Kamikaze. And we'll reconvene when you come back to the States to talk about Wakefield Pool.
Absolutely, yes. We're saving Wakefield Pool for Midsummer Fire Island shenanigans. I think fittingly.
Perfect.
No, but always an unmitigated delight to be in cahoots with you. So we will definitely talk soon.
Always.